Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
During the toast, my mother said, "Only one of my kids truly brought honor to this family." I stood, pulled a letter from my bag, and said, "Cool. Then you'll love what her employer just sent me." The color drained from her face as she opened it. The truth is, I wasn't even supposed to be there that night. I'd RSVP'd maybe weeks ago and had mentally prepped to make some excuse last minute. Probably a migraine, maybe flights delayed, something that didn't stir the pot too much. But something in me just shifted. I stared at the date circled in red on the calendar, a dinner to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, and thought, why should I be the one who always skips? Why should I be the one quietly disappearing from events that feel like a painful performance just to keep the peace? So against my better judgment, I booked a ticket, picked out a simple but sharp black dress that said, "I'm fine, really," and made sure I packed the letter, the one I got 2 weeks earlier, forwarded accidentally to my inbox instead of my sister's. The event was being held at a fancy little Italian place that probably hadn't changed their wallpaper since Reagan was in office, but it had white linen tablecloths and a string quartet near the back window, and I could already smell too much garlic by the time I stepped in. Everyone looked nice, polished, as if every sibling and cousin and childhood neighbor had agreed to show up and shine. But when I walked in, it was like the air snapped for a second. My mom smiled with that frozen expression that looks more like a mask than joy. My dad hugged me stiffly. Emily, of course, looked flawless, blonde blowout, diamond studs. That perfect, effortless glow she always carried. "Avery, you made it," she beamed, and it took everything in me not to roll my eyes. We sat down, and the small talk started, the usual. Uncle Ron complaining about taxes, Aunt Jill whispering about her latest cleanse, someone bringing up the time I supposedly cried at my own 8th grade recital. I hadn't, by the way. I had allergies. No one asked about my job, of course. No one ever really did. I had quietly built a solid career in nonprofit logistics, managing disaster relief distribution for one of the most respected organizations in the country. But it wasn't flashy. It didn't come with titles like consultant or partner or chief innovation officer, so it rarely came up. But Emily, oh, she was a star. Every time. Her LinkedIn updates got read out loud like bedtime stories. Harvard MBA, strategic director at Bradford & Comey, 6-figure salary before 30, married to some guy named Chase, who did something with crypto and who always looked like he was either about to sell you a car or sue you for not buying it. By the time the entrees were cleared and champagne was being poured for toasts, I was already halfway through my second glass, fingers brushing the envelope inside my purse like it was a grenade. I hadn't decided whether I'd use it. Part of me just needed to feel the weight of it there, like insurance, just in case things went too far, just in case Mom couldn't help herself. And of course, she couldn't. She stood up, cleared her throat like she was addressing a boardroom instead of her own family. And with a glass raised in her left hand, she started down memory lane. 40 years, she began, smiling at my father, who nodded like he'd heard the speech rehearsed in the car. 2 amazing children, 1 beautiful home, and a life filled with purpose. Not perfect, but blessed. So far, so good. Then it came. The moment she looked directly at Emily, her voice softening into that sweet maternal warmth she always reserved for her, and said the words I would never forget. "Only one of my kids truly brought honor to this family." She laughed as if it were a joke, but her eyes didn't flicker, not once. I felt something twist behind my ribs. The room was still, the moment frozen in that weird, slow way that car accidents feel right before the crash. I could feel eyes flickering toward me, cousins, spouses, even my dad's tight-lipped glance, and I could practically hear the unspoken thoughts. How will Avery take that? I took it standing up. I stood, gently placed my napkin on the table, and reached into my bag, pulling out the letter, the one from Bradford & Company, addressed to Emily, but mistakenly sent to me, likely due to our names being listed together on some old family contact list. I held it up and smiled. "Cool," I said, with a calmness that surprised even me. Then you'll love what her employer just sent me. There was a flicker of confusion across my mother's face, followed by a flicker of something else. Recognition, maybe, or fear. She slowly lowered her glass and I walked toward her seat, unfolding the crisp white page and handing it over. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. My sister, still smiling politely, seemed frozen, like she hadn't processed yet that something had shifted. I said nothing else. I didn't need to. The letter said plenty. And as my mother's eyes scanned the first paragraph, I watched the color drain from her face. Her fingers clutched the page like it might fly away. Around us, silence. I stood there, letting it hang in the air. This wasn't just about a toast. This wasn't just about one more dig at the daughter she'd never fully embraced. This was about truth, and whether or not she could stomach it. And then, quietly, she looked up at me, like she didn't recognize me anymore. That was the first time I saw fear in her eyes. And I knew right then that this dinner was going to change everything. I used to think being invisible in your own family was painful, until I realized being seen only when you disappoint them feels even worse. Back when we were kids, before careers and toasts and letters that could turn a whole room upside down, Emily and I shared a bedroom lined with matching white twin beds and a single old bookshelf sagging in the middle, always too full of her neat rows of trophies and my forgotten half-colored sketchbooks. She had the spotlight early, and I don't mean that as a metaphor. I mean literal lights, stage makeup, the works. Dance recitals, speech contests, piano solos. If there was a microphone and an audience, Emily was already there, standing center stage, bathed in applause, before I could even figure out what side of the auditorium I was supposed to sit on. It wasn't that I didn't try. I did. I remember trying out for the middle school musical in 7th grade, something about pirates and mistaken identities. And while Emily played the lead, I ended up as villager number 5, which meant I walked across stage twice and waved. Mom still brought flowers to Emily, posed for photos with her backstage, and managed not to make eye contact with me the entire evening. That sort of thing leaves a mark, not right away, not even all at once, but over time. It seeps in, settles under your skin, until you stop expecting anything different, until you start building a life that requires no applause, no audience, just your own quiet sense of dignity and survival. I think that's why I chose logistics. It's a world of details and movement and coordination, where everything works best when no one notices who's pulling the strings. I built something real. Teams, networks, emergency protocols, supply chains that help people get clean water and shelter after hurricanes. I kept things running in the background, no spotlights, no ceremonies, just results. And for a while, I was okay with that. But Emily, she kept climbing. I lost track of how many degrees she collected, how many panels she spoke on, how many headshots she had taken for press releases. The family group chat, which I muted years ago, was basically an ongoing highlight reel of her accomplishments. Look who's featured in Forbes. Look who just got a promotion. Look who met the governor. Sometimes I'd go months without hearing from my mother directly, and then a birthday text would come in, usually an hour late, occasionally misspelled, and I'd remember that in our story, I'd always been the side character. It all would have stayed background noise if not for the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope with the company's name embossed at the top, something clinical and forgettable, except my name was on it. I thought it was a mistake at first. I'd never worked with Bradford and Comey, and the return address was unfamiliar, but when I opened it, my heart didn't race immediately. No alarm bells, just confusion. It was a memo, internal but not confidential, about a performance review tied to a highly sensitive client engagement involving international regulatory issues. It included phrases like ethics flag, undisclosed conflict of interest, and inappropriate use of strategic data. And there it was, Emily's name, not hidden or encrypted, but typed out cleanly under team lead. At first I told myself it was probably nothing. Bureaucratic language can make anything sound criminal. I reread it 5 times, scanning for context, looking for the part where it said it had all been resolved, all been a misunderstanding, all been someone else's responsibility. But instead, the more I read, the more it felt like a warning, like something that had slipped out when it shouldn't have. And somewhere deep in my stomach, the kind of anger that doesn't explode right away, but brews like a storm began to form. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. I just folded it back up, slid it into a folder, and left it there on my desk under a stack of bills and unopened mail, pretending I hadn't seen it while it grew heavier in my mind by the day. But then the dinner invite came. The group chat blew up with excitement. Emily had booked the restaurant. Emily was organizing the photo slideshow. Emily was making a speech. And Mom, of course, made sure everyone knew how proud she was of her firstborn leader. That was the word she used. Leader. I wasn't even sure she remembered what I did for a living anymore. I told myself I'd go, say congratulations, smile politely, and leave. I wouldn't cause a scene. That wasn't who I was. But then 2 days before the dinner, I got another envelope. This one wasn't a mistake. It was addressed to me, same company, same branding. Only this time, it included something extra. An internal review log with flagged correspondence, notes from compliance officers, and a vague but chilling reference to a recent leak outside firm walls. That's when I realized something. Emily hadn't just made a mistake. She was involved in something that could cost her everything if it ever went public. Something that, if exposed, would shift the family narrative in ways none of them were ready for. And whether the letter reached me by accident or on purpose, I suddenly held a truth in my hands that no one else at that table would see coming. I packed it in my purse, not because I wanted revenge, not at first, but because I needed to know that if she, or anyone else, stood up again and said I was the disappointment, the one who never measured up, the one who didn't bring honor to the family, I could finally, fully say otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, watch their faces when they saw what real disappointment looked like. I had no intention of turning the dinner into a public reckoning, but the moment her name was praised like scripture, I knew silence would only bury me deeper. By the time the evening was in full swing, with silverware clinking softly against china, and waiters weaving through tables in practice arcs, I had rehearsed what I might say so many times in my head that my internal voice had begun to fray around the edges, torn between defiance and restraint, between the long-buried ache of being constantly overlooked and the cold logic reminding me that once something leaves your mouth, it can never be put back in. The restaurant, dimly lit with flickering votives on every table and that low hum of moneyed conversation that always feels vaguely performative, carried the kind of energy that dares you to behave, dares you to play nice, dares you to swallow your truth so the evening can remain pretty and uninterrupted. And yet, there I was, sitting between an aunt who smelled faintly of eucalyptus and an old neighbor who still called me the quiet Harper girl, my hand lightly resting on my clutch like it was a trigger. Emily, unsurprisingly, had orchestrated the entire thing with the precision of someone who thrives on details that impress rather than matter. She'd chosen the wine pairings, arranged for a screen to run a looping photo montage of our parents' life together, and made sure that the napkins matched the flowers and the flowers matched the invitations. I watched her glide from one end of the table to the other, greeting each guest with the kind of soft charisma that makes people trust you even when they shouldn't, laughing at jokes she didn't find funny, giving compliments she didn't mean, and soaking up the warmth of admiration like it was oxygen. I suppose I should have been used to it by then. The way everything always bent itself to accommodate her. The way every occasion somehow doubled as an Emily appreciation hour. The way even my father, who used to sneak me extra slices of cake when I was 8 and crying in my room, had learned to smile and nod through her successes like he was contractually obligated to celebrate her at regular intervals. But that night, something in the air was different. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe I had finally reached the limit of how much self-erasure a person can endure without some part of them beginning to rise back to the surface. The actual toast started with my mother tapping her knife lightly against her champagne flute, a sound so practiced and delicate that everyone at the table turned toward her in near perfect unison, like disciples awaiting wisdom. She smiled, wide and polished, and began with the usual pleasantries. How grateful she was for everyone's presence, how much she and my father had cherished their years together, how proud they were of the family they'd built. And then, with a slight pause that felt both dramatic and fully intentional, she said the words that would splinter something fundamental between us. "We've been blessed with 2 children," she said, her eyes landing squarely on Emily with an expression so tender it made my stomach clench. "And while we love them both, I think it's fair to say that only one of them has truly brought honor to this family." There was a moment of silence so thick it made my ears ring. Some guests chuckled softly, unsure if it was meant to be humorous, while others just smiled awkwardly and looked toward me, their expressions flickering between sympathy and discomfort. I didn't move, I didn't speak, but I felt my grip on the purse tighten, my fingers finding the edge of the envelope and curling around it like a lifeline. For a moment, I considered doing nothing again, letting it slide, smiling politely, letting the evening continue on its safe, pre-approved course. But then I remembered the nights I cried alone, the milestones ignored, the quiet betrayals dressed up as jokes, the years of being reduced to a footnote in my own family's narrative. I remembered the letter, and I stood. The movement was small, subtle, but it shifted the entire table. Conversations halted. Forks paused midair. Even Emily's carefully curated expression wavered ever so slightly, a flicker of confusion passing through her eyes like a cloud across the sun. My voice, when it came, was even and calm. Not a shout, not a sob, just a simple statement delivered with the weight of a decade of silence. "Well," I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out the letter with a deliberate, almost cinematic slowness. "Then you're going to love what her employer just sent me." I stepped forward, not dramatically, but with intention, and placed the unfolded letter gently in front of my mother, like it was a bill for something long overdue. Her hand hesitated, hovering above the paper as though afraid to touch it, before finally picking it up. I watched her eyes scan the top of the page, the header bearing the unmistakable emblem of Bradford and Company, and I knew the exact moment she reached the part that mattered, because her mouth parted slightly, her brow tightened, and her posture shifted like someone bracing for impact. Emily, to her credit, didn't immediately lose her composure. She simply said, "What is that?" Her voice dipped in artificial confusion, as though she couldn't imagine what sort of nonsense I'd dragged into the room. But I knew better. I saw the minute widening of her pupils, the way she leaned slightly toward the paper like she needed to confirm it was the version she feared. My mother read silently, her hands beginning to tremble just enough for the champagne in her glass to quiver like a lie unraveling. The words on the page, phrases like internal compliance concern, investigative review pending, and compromised client data, seemed to float in the air around her like smoke. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. The silence did the talking for me, stretching on and growing heavier with every second her eyes stayed locked to that damning page. When she finally looked up at me, her face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with age or lighting. There was no anger there yet, no disbelief, just a hollow sort of dread. The kind that comes from realizing that something you built your entire story on might not be as solid as you believed. And just like that, the dinner turned, not loudly, not with screaming or glass-shattering fury, but with a slow and almost elegant collapse. The air shifted, conversations resumed in false starts, people looked everywhere but at us, and the moment fractured into something no one could quite piece back together. Emily reached for the letter then, hand outstretched and shaking slightly, but I pulled it back. "You can read it later," I said softly, and then I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving behind only the echo of everything they hadn't wanted to see. In families like ours, silence is currency, and for years I let them spend me like loose change, until I realized I was the only one paying for everyone else's comfort. When I stepped out of the restaurant into the thick, humid air that wrapped around the late evening like a damp curtain, I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated or even particularly brave, despite what the tension-laced silence behind me might have suggested. What I felt, standing there under the soft glow of an old street lamp with the letter now folded neatly and safely tucked back into my bag, was something far less romantic and far more unsettling. A heavy, buzzing kind of clarity that pulsed behind my eyes and warned me, in no uncertain terms, that this wasn't over, not even close. The quiet unraveling that had just begun inside that carefully curated dining room wasn't the finale. It was the prelude to something messier, deeper, and far more personal than I'd prepared for. I stayed outside for several minutes, watching the cars drift past, listening to the sounds of silverware clatter and forced laughter leaking from the open windows, like ghosts trying to convince themselves they were still alive. I knew I'd caused a scene, though I hadn't raised my voice or flung a glass or stormed out with melodrama. But sometimes all it takes to shatter a myth is a single unfiltered truth handed over with no apology. And what I'd just done wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was to them a betrayal. Not of trust, but of structure. I had upended the quiet hierarchy they had built so meticulously, one toast and one backhanded compliment at a time, and in doing so, I had stepped out of my assigned role, black sheep, disappointment, the daughter who keeps her head down and her mouth shut, and stepped into something that made them nervous, something unpredictable. It wasn't long before my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a series of messages that began with cautious curiosity and quickly devolved into thinly veiled panic. First came Emily, no words, just 3 dots hovering and disappearing repeatedly like she was typing and deleting messages over and over again, trying to find a version of herself that could explain away what I now knew. Then came Mom, her text clipped and cold. "We need to talk. Call me." As if she were my supervisor and I'd skipped a shift. I didn't respond, not right away. I needed to think. I needed to breathe. And more importantly, I needed to decide what the next move should be. Because make no mistake, I had started something that couldn't be undone with silence or forgiveness, or another round of wine-soaked nostalgia. Later that night, I sat in the tiny hotel room I'd rented a few blocks away, its decor outdated and its air conditioner rattling with the persistence of something trying not to break. I opened my laptop and pulled up the original email thread, the one I had almost ignored when it first landed in my inbox, because I thought it was spam or an automated notification. But now, looking at it with the knowledge of how deeply it rattled my mother and how desperately Emily had avoided even acknowledging it, I began to see it for what it was. Not just a memo or a red flag, but a breadcrumb leading to something bigger. What caught my eye this time was a name buried in the forwarded chain, someone listed in CC who I didn't recognize. A compliance officer, someone internal, someone with access. I took a gamble and sent them a brief, carefully worded message, asking for clarification and subtly implying that I was in possession of a document that might have been sent to the wrong recipient. I didn't lie, I didn't threaten, I simply asked. And within an hour, I had a reply. It was vague, as expected, but it confirmed one thing I needed to know. The situation involving Emily was real, it was ongoing, and it had implications that extended beyond a slap on the wrist. There were investigations, both internal and external. There were discussions about liability, and there was, according to the message, an anonymous source from within the company who had begun sharing information outside official channels because they feared a cover-up. That source, the email suggested, may have been the reason I received the letter in the first place. And just like that, the ground shifted again. Because now I wasn't just holding on to evidence of my sister's ethical lapse. I was in the orbit of something larger, something that could pull in others if it came to light. Maybe that was why Emily looked so rattled at the dinner, not just because I had proof of her missteps, but because she had no idea who else might be watching her, waiting for the right moment to speak. I leaned back in the stiff hotel chair, the letter now spread out beside my laptop, and stared at it, trying to decide what I wanted. Did I want revenge? Did I want justice? Or did I simply want to force my family to see me, not the version they had constructed over decades of neglect and comparison, but the version who had clawed her way out of the corner they'd painted her into? The next morning, before I even had a chance to check my email again, I received a call from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail, and when I played it back, I heard a voice I didn't recognize. It was clipped and professional, but there was an edge of urgency beneath the surface. "I believe you have something that concerns us both," the voice said. "Please don't share anything until we speak." No name, no company, just that. I listened to it twice, then again, my mind spiraling with possibilities. Had the anonymous source reached out directly? Was it someone trying to bury the story? Or was it someone closer, someone who knew me? The pieces were moving now, whether I wanted them to or not. And for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to someone else's script. I was writing my own. I closed my laptop slowly, stood up, and looked in the mirror over the desk. There was a time I would have turned away from that reflection, but now I studied her, shoulders square, jaw set, eyes unflinching, and I realized something that made my pulse steady. They were right to be afraid. When you grow up as the family's disappointment, people never expect you to become the person holding all the cards. But the thing about underdogs is, no one sees them coming until it's far too late. It's strange how quiet the world feels when you realize that, for once in your life, you're the one who has the power to burn it all down. The morning after the dinner felt almost unnaturally still, like the air itself was holding its breath, as if waiting to see what I would do next, whether I'd press forward or retreat, whether I'd fold the letter back into its envelope and slide it into a drawer like a weapon I never planned to use, or whether I'd aim it squarely at the myth my family had spent years polishing and let it explode into something too big to ignore. I stood by the hotel window, coffee cooling in my hand, eyes scanning the quiet street below, and I could almost hear my mother's voice echoing in my head, that sharp, clipped tone she used when she thought something had gotten out of hand. We do not air family business in front of outsiders. But the truth was, this wasn't just family business anymore. This was damage with a paper trail, and my sister had left fingerprints on every page. I didn't return any of their calls that morning. I ignored the messages, let the texts pile up in clusters of blue bubbles and passive-aggressive punctuation. I needed space, not just to think, but to strategize, because what I held in my hands wasn't simply revenge. It was leverage. And the question I kept circling around wasn't whether I could destroy my sister's carefully curated career, but whether I should. Because somewhere beneath the fury, beneath the years of being overlooked and dismissed and minimized, was a much harder truth to sit with. If I did this, if I fully exposed what she had done, I wouldn't just be punishing her. I'd be shattering the illusion that had kept our entire family functioning for decades. And some part of me, however small, still wasn't sure I was ready for what might be left once that illusion was gone. It wasn't until early afternoon that I heard the knock at my door. No announcement, no call ahead, just 3 knocks. I opened it, not knowing who I expected. Maybe Emily, maybe even my mother, but it was my father. He looked older than I remembered, shoulders slumped under the weight of something unspoken. Eyes clouded with the kind of weariness that comes not from age, but from watching too much happen for too long without saying a word. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, his silence pressing against the walls like humidity, and sat on the edge of the stiff armchair without looking at me. "She told me what happened," he said eventually, voice low and rough. "Your sister, she told me about the letter." I said nothing, just watched him, trying to read between the lines of what he wasn't saying, trying to figure out whether he was here to defend her, to beg me to keep quiet, or to finally, after all these years, take my side. But when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were not pleading, they were tired. "I don't know what you want to do with it," he continued slowly. But I came here to tell you something you probably already figured out a long time ago. We didn't treat you fairly. Your mother, she has always seen Emily as a reflection of herself. You were different, too different. And instead of learning how to love that difference, we let ourselves pretend it meant you weren't enough. That's on us, that's on me. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. And though it didn't fix anything, though it didn't rewrite the decades of being cast in the background, it chipped away at something inside me that I hadn't realized had calcified. I nodded once and sat down across from him, the letter still resting on the desk nearby. A silent third presence in the room. I'm not going to pretend I know what you should do, he said, rising slowly. But I hope whatever it is, you do it for yourself, not for us. After he left, I stared at the letter again, now stained slightly at one corner from where my coffee cup had rested earlier, and I opened my laptop. The email from the compliance officer had sat unread since last night, its subject line still marked with a discreet red flag. I opened it, read through it once more, and then scrolled to the bottom where the officer had left one final line. If you're willing to talk, we'll protect your identity. The offer dangled there like a key, and I realized then that the story wasn't just about Emily, or about me, or even about the broken bones of our family's foundation. It was about systems and truths and the cost of staying silent when you know something isn't right. I could say yes. I could send the documents, provide my statement, become part of something bigger than this family's petty hierarchy. Or I could walk away, let the family patch itself back together around a lie, and return to my quiet corner with the grim satisfaction of knowing I could have done more. Instead, I did something no one expected. I called Emily. She didn't pick up the first time, or the second. But on the third try, she answered. Her voice shaky, small, stripped of the confidence that usually dressed it up. Avery, she said, not a greeting, not an accusation, just my name, like she couldn't quite believe I'd called. I want to meet, I said firm, in person, just us. That afternoon, we met at a small cafe halfway between her house and my hotel. She looked thinner, paler, like the stress had peeled back the polish and left behind the fragile scaffolding underneath. She sat across from me without touching her drink, fingers laced so tightly they were nearly white at the knuckles. I know you're scared, I said, calm, clear, and I know you think I'm here to ruin you. But I'm not. I'm here because you need to fix this. Not for me, not for Mom, for yourself. She didn't deny anything. She didn't argue. She just nodded, slowly, like someone who had finally run out of excuses. And then I handed her the letter, not as a threat, not as a punishment, but as a mirror. You tell her the truth, I said, meaning our mother. You come clean, and you figure out how to be the kind of person they always pretended you were. She looked at me, eyes brimming with something I couldn't name, shame maybe, or gratitude, and I stood up to leave. As I walked out, my phone vibrated again. It was another message from the anonymous number, the one that had reached out before. Only this time, it read, The inside story isn't just at Bradford. You might want to take a look at your father's name, too. I stopped in my tracks, the noise of the street fading around me as my brain tried to make sense of what I'd just read. My father, the man who had just apologized, the one who had, for the first time in my life, acknowledged my pain. I didn't open the attachment right away. I slid the phone into my pocket and kept walking, heart pounding with the weight of what might come next. Because that's the thing about truth. Once you start digging, you better be ready to find more than you bargained for.